Here's a statement that should stop you cold. The United States spent 70 years, trillions of dollars, and hundreds of thousands of lives building influence across the Middle East. And in less than a decade, China has quietly walked into that space without firing a single bullet. Not one. And if you think this is just about oil deals and energy contracts, you are missing the actual story. You are looking at the surface of something that runs far, far deeper. What's happening right now between the Middle East and Beijing is one of the most consequential geopolitical realignments of the 21st century, and almost nobody in Western media is explaining it correctly. I want to change that today. What I'm going to show you in this video is not the version you're getting from cable news or think tanks funded by Washington insiders. I'm going to show you three specific structural forces that are pulling the Middle East toward Beijing in ways that cannot be reversed simply by a new American administration, a new foreign policy doctrine, or another aircraft carrier parked in the Persian Gulf. These three forces are the architecture of dependency, the digital sovereignty offer, and what I call the non-judgment dividend. Each one operates differently. Each one is more sophisticated than the last. And together, they explain why this pivot is not a moment, it's a direction. Let's start with force number one, the architecture of dependency. Here's what most Western analysts get wrong about China's engagement in the Middle East. They frame it as transactional. China needs oil. Gulf states have oil. Simple exchange. Done. But that framing misses something fundamental about how Beijing actually operates, and I want to show you the numbers that matter. Between 2013 and 2023, China invested approximately $273 billion across Middle Eastern infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative. Not $270 billion, not nearly $300 billion, $273 billion. Ports, railways, industrial zones, fiber optic networks, smart city platforms, logistics corridors. The kind of infrastructure that doesn't just connect economies, it binds them. Look at what happened in Saudi Arabia. China's CITIC construction built the Jizan economic city. Huawei is embedded in the kingdom's 5G rollout. Chinese firms are deeply involved in NEOM-adjacent logistics infrastructure. And here's what nobody tells you about infrastructure investment at this scale. It doesn't just create economic dependency. It creates technical dependency. It creates maintenance dependency. It creates data dependency. When a country's telecommunications backbone runs on Huawei hardware, who do they call when there's a problem? When a port's automated logistics system was designed and built in Shenzhen, who holds the technical documentation? This is the architecture of dependency, and it is being constructed quietly and methodically across the entire region. I talked to a logistics consultant who has worked on port development projects in both Oman and Djibouti, and he told me something I haven't forgotten. He said, "The Americans build relationships, the Chinese build systems, and systems outlast relationships every single time." Think about what that means for a moment. Now here's the uncomfortable truth about why Middle Eastern governments actually welcome this. For decades, American infrastructure engagement in the region came with strings: democratic reform conditions, human rights benchmarks, congressional oversight, media scrutiny. Every major deal was a potential political liability, both for the Gulf states signing it and the American administration approving it. China showed up with something radically different. No conditions, no press conferences about women's rights, no Senate hearings, just engineers, financing, and a contract. And for governments that have spent decades navigating American political pressure while simultaneously relying on American security guarantees, that offer was not just convenient. It was intoxicating. The architecture of dependency works because it meets a real need, at a real scale, with a real efficiency that Western alternatives simply haven't matched. The G7's Build Back Better World initiative, announced in 2021, promised $600 billion in global infrastructure by 2027. As of today, the actual committed and deployed capital falls dramatically short of that number. China doesn't announce, China builds. And that distinction between announcement and execution is at the core of why this realignment is accelerating. But force number one is actually just the foundation. Because what China layered on top of the infrastructure story is something even more sophisticated. Something that strikes at a vulnerability no Gulf state will admit publicly, but every single one of them feels deeply. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything about how you'll understand this pivot going forward. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently from the infrastructure play. This one is psychological. It's political. And honestly, it might be the most powerful of the three. Force number 2, the digital sovereignty offer. The digital. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you need to understand something about how Middle Eastern governments think about their own survival. These are not democracies managing public opinion cycles. These are governing systems that have an existential relationship with information control. And for the last 2 decades, they have been living with a contradiction that keeps their leadership up at night. They depend on Western technology, American platforms, American cloud infrastructure, American payment systems, while simultaneously understanding that those same systems represent a potential threat to their internal stability. Every WhatsApp message sent in Riyadh travels through servers that American intelligence agencies have legal frameworks to access. Every financial transaction processed through SWIFT is visible to the U.S. Treasury. Every Google search, every Instagram post, every digital interaction runs through an architecture that Washington, in theory, can monitor, restrict, or shut down. Here's what nobody tells you about that reality. The 2012 Arab Spring didn't just teach Middle Eastern governments about the power of social media. It taught them about the danger of depending on foreign-controlled digital infrastructure during a political crisis. They watched governments fall partly because they couldn't control the information environment. And they made a mental note that they never forgot. Now enter China with something extraordinary. Not just hardware, not just 5G towers and fiber cables. China arrived with a complete alternative digital ecosystem, and more importantly, with a governance model for that ecosystem that Middle Eastern leaders found deeply, deeply attractive. Let me show you what this actually means on the ground. Huawei's smart city platform is currently deployed in over 40 cities across the Middle East and North Africa. That number is not an estimate. 40-plus cities. These platforms integrate traffic management, facial recognition, payment systems, emergency services, and public surveillance into a single unified architecture. And here's the critical point. The data from these systems stays within national borders, managed under bilateral agreements with Beijing rather than subject to American legal jurisdiction or European data protection frameworks. For a government in Abu Dhabi or Riyadh, that is not a minor technical distinction. That is the difference between sovereignty and dependency. A senior technology policy advisor I spoke with, someone who has consulted for multiple Gulf governments on digital infrastructure, told me off the record, these governments don't trust Washington with their data any more than they trust Tehran with their borders. At least Beijing isn't trying to change their political system. That quote tells you everything. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because this next part is where the story gets truly fascinating. Here's what the mainstream conversation completely misses about the digital sovereignty offer. It's not just about surveillance capability or data control, it's about financial architecture. Because running parallel to the hardware story is something called mBridge, a multi-currency digital payment platform developed collaboratively by China, the UAE, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia. That allows cross-border transactions to settle in central bank digital currencies, completely bypassing the SWIFT system and, by extension, bypassing the US dollar's dominance in international settlements. In 2023, mBridge processed its first real-value transactions. Not a pilot, not a test. Real transactions. And the implications of that single fact for American financial power are staggering in ways that I don't think most people have fully absorbed. The US dollar's reserve status doesn't rest on military power alone. It rests on the fact that the world's trade, particularly energy trade, must flow through dollar-denominated systems. If the Gulf states, the world's largest energy exporters, begin settling even a fraction of their oil sales in a digital currency system that bypasses the dollar, the mathematical foundations of American financial hegemony start to shift. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you exactly how in just a moment. Because force number 2 creates the infrastructure for force number 3. And force number 3 is the one that makes Western policymakers genuinely nervous when they speak honestly. The question you should be asking right now is this. If China is offering infrastructure without conditions and digital sovereignty without compromise, what exactly does America still have to offer that the Middle East actually wants? That answer is more complicated than you think. And it leads directly into the third and most counterintuitive force driving this entire realignment. Let me be direct with you before I introduce force number 3, because this is the part of the conversation that makes people genuinely uncomfortable, not uncomfortable in a conspiratorial way, uncomfortable in the way that happens when a truth challenges something you assumed was permanent. Force number 3 is called the non-judgment dividend. And to understand it properly, I need to ask you something. When was the last time you heard a Chinese official publicly lecture a Gulf state about press freedom? About political prisoners? About the treatment of migrant workers? About democratic representation? Take your time. I'll wait. The answer, of course, is never. And that silence, that deliberate, strategic, carefully maintained silence, is worth more to Middle Eastern governments than almost any infrastructure contract or digital platform Beijing has ever offered. Because what China is selling at its core is something America stopped selling decades ago: unconditional partnership. Here's what the mainstream gets catastrophically wrong about this dynamic. Western analysts look at China's non-interference policy and frame it as moral cowardice, as an absence of values, as proof that Beijing is simply an amoral transactional actor willing to work with anyone regardless of how they govern. And maybe there's truth in that framing. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. From the perspective of a Gulf monarchy, that moral cowardice looks exactly like respect. Let me show you the numbers that matter here, because this isn't just philosophical. A 2023 survey conducted across 16 Arab nations by the Arab Barometer, arguably the most rigorous public opinion research project operating in the region, found that 35% of respondents viewed China favorably as an external power, compared to 26% for the United States. Among younger respondents under 30, China's favorability gap over the US was even wider. This is not an accident. This is the accumulated dividend of decades of non-interference paying out in real public opinion data. But here's what that survey doesn't capture, and this is the layer that matters most at the governmental level. It's not just that China doesn't criticize, it's that China actively validates. When I was researching the 2016 Saudi Vision 2030 announcement, something struck me about the international response. Western governments offered cautious praise, laced with questions about implementation, labor rights, and political reform. The IMF attached analytical caveats. European partners raised concerns about diversification timelines. China sent trade delegations and signed cooperation agreements. Full stop. No caveats, no conditions, no public skepticism. For Mohammed bin Salman, building a new national identity for Saudi Arabia on the global stage, that Chinese response wasn't just diplomatically convenient. It was strategically invaluable. Because China's endorsement, implicit or explicit, carries a message to other developing and emerging economies. This government is a legitimate partner. This vision is worth engaging. This is the non-judgment dividend operating at full power. Now here's where it gets even more sophisticated, and this is the part that should genuinely surprise you. China's non-interference isn't just passive, it isn't simply the absence of criticism. Beijing has actively constructed multilateral frameworks, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the expanded BRICS architecture, the Global Development Initiative, that provide Middle Eastern governments with alternative institutional legitimacy outside of Western-dominated systems like the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations Human Rights Council. Saudi Arabia and the UAE joined the expanded BRICS framework in 2024. Egypt joined. Iran joined. Ethiopia joined. This was not a random clustering of dissatisfied nations. This was a coordinated enrollment into an alternative legitimacy ecosystem, one that China architected specifically to give governments a place to stand that isn't defined by Washington's rules or Brussels standards. The expanded BRICS bloc now represents approximately 37.3% of global GDP when measured at purchasing power parity. Not 35%. Not roughly 40%. 37.3%. And that number is growing while the G7's proportional share of global economic output continues its decade-long decline. Here's what makes people truly uncomfortable when they sit with these three forces together. The architecture of dependency, the digital sovereignty offer, and the non-judgment dividend aren't three separate Chinese strategies. They are three interlocking components of a single, coherent geopolitical architecture, one that was designed not to confront American power directly, but to make American power progressively irrelevant to the decisions that matter most. And that distinction between confrontation and irrelevance is perhaps the most important strategic insight in this entire conversation. Because you can defend against a rival who challenges you. You cannot easily defend against a rival who simply makes you unnecessary. The question now is, where does this actually lead? What do the next 10 years look like if these three forces continue operating at the pace they're currently moving? And is there anything at all, that could reverse this trajectory? Let me pull this together, because the synthesis is where the real insight lives. Let me pull this together, because individually, these three forces are significant. But combined, understood as a single integrated system, they represent something that geopolitical analysts haven't had a clean framework for describing. Until now. I want to give this framework a name, because naming something is the first step to understanding it clearly. What China has built across the Middle East is what I call the frictionless empire. Not an empire in the colonial sense. No occupation, no military governors, no imposed legal systems. A frictionless empire operates entirely differently. It creates dependency without domination. It builds influence without issuing demands. It constructs loyalty not through fear or ideology, but through utility, by simply being more useful, more available, more accommodating, and more consistent than the alternative. And here's what makes the frictionless empire genuinely unprecedented in modern geopolitical history. It is almost entirely self-reinforcing. Every port China builds makes the next infrastructure deal easier to justify. Every 5G network deployed makes the alternative digital ecosystem more necessary to maintain. Every BRICS summit attended makes Western institutional frameworks slightly less essential. The architecture compounds. The dependency deepens. The alternatives narrow. Here's what matters most about this moment in time. We are not at the beginning of this process. We are somewhere in the middle of it, which means the trajectory is already established, the momentum is already significant, and the window for meaningful course correction is narrowing faster than most Western policymakers are willing to publicly acknowledge. A senior economist I spoke with, someone who has advised both the World Bank and several Gulf sovereign wealth funds, told me something that stuck with me. He said, "The Americans keep asking how to win the Middle East back, but that's the wrong question. The right question is whether the Middle East was ever theirs to keep in the first place." That reframing matters enormously. Now let me give you 3 scenarios for where this goes over the next decade, because the future isn't predetermined. There are genuinely different paths from here. Scenario 1, gradual bifurcation. The Middle East doesn't fully choose Beijing over Washington. Instead, it perfects the art of strategic ambiguity, maintaining American security relationships for military deterrence while deepening Chinese economic and digital integration for everything else. Gulf states become expert at playing both powers simultaneously, extracting maximum benefit from each without full commitment to either. This is actually the most likely near-term trajectory, and in many ways, it's already happening. Saudi Arabia hosts American military assets and Chinese 5G infrastructure simultaneously. That is not a contradiction. That is a strategy. Scenario 2, accelerated decoupling. A triggering event, a major U.S. policy decision, a regional conflict where American response disappoints, or a significant dollar system disruption accelerates the timeline dramatically. Gulf states move more quickly than expected toward yuan-denominated energy settlements, deeper BRICS integration, and formal digital infrastructure divorce from Western systems. The mBridge platform scales faster than projected. This scenario is less likely in the immediate term, but becomes significantly more probable if American domestic political dysfunction continues to undermine foreign policy consistency. Scenario 3, Western recalibration. The United States and its partners genuinely overhaul their engagement model, dropping the conditionality framework, matching China's infrastructure deployment speed, offering credible digital sovereignty alternatives, and treating Middle Eastern governments as strategic partners rather than reform projects. This scenario is theoretically possible. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It would require a fundamental shift in how Washington understands its own role in the world. And there is very little evidence that shift is imminent. Here's what I want you to take away from this entire conversation. The Middle East pivot to Beijing is not a betrayal of the West. It is a rational response to a changed environment by governments making calculated decisions about their own survival and prosperity. You don't have to agree with how those governments operate internally to understand the logic driving their external choices. The frictionless empire didn't win the Middle East through propaganda or coercion. It won, and is continuing to win, by solving real problems at real scale with real consistency. Infrastructure without conditions, digital sovereignty without compromise, partnership without judgment, that combination, offered at the moment when American credibility in the region was at historic lows following 2 decades of military misadventures, didn't just find a receptive audience, it found a vacuum. And in geopolitics, as in nature, vacuums don't stay empty for long. If this analysis gave you a framework you haven't seen elsewhere, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of structural analysis I bring every single week. And I want to leave you with one question to think about and drop in the comments below. If you were advising the US government right now, what is the single most important thing Washington could do to slow this realignment? And do you think American politics is even capable of executing it? I read every comment. Let me know what you think.